Welcome to the sixth episode of the Georgian Elections Guide 2024. We'll start with a discussion of Bidzina Ivanishvili's recent interview. Then we'll reflect on the Europe March that took place Sunday. Additionally, we'll cover the McCain Institute's briefing report on Georgian elections, the Gvaramia scandal, and the voting patterns of young people. We'll also examine the recent elections in Moldova and their potential impact on Georgia. Finally, we'll delve into the EU Parliament resolution, the memory politics around it, and we'll also discuss what Georgian workers want. But before we begin, let's introduce the panels today. Gia, why don't we start with you?
Hello, my name is Georgi, and I study political science in Tbilisi.
Rezi?
Um, Hello, I am Revaz Karanadze. I'm a Georgian political economist and a union organizer and a former student activist based in Tbilisi, Georgia.
My name is Brian Gigantino. I am a historian and co-creator of the podcast Reimagining Soviet Georgia.
And I'm Sopo Japaridze. I'm also the co-host of Imagining Soviet Georgia, and I'm also head of Solidarity Network, Independent Union. Let's begin. So last night, I stayed up late watching Bidzina Ivanishvili, the founder and the financer of Georgian Dream, the ruling party of Georgia. He had an exclusive interview with a sort of pro-government channel. And I found it quite revealing in a lot of ways. Let's open discussion. Either I can start or maybe somebody wants to discuss it first. Rezi?
No, you can go actually.
Okay, so I'll tell you what I think. I mean, there were many things on there, but I think like there were quite a couple of sort of explosive moments. So one was how there was an incident with the former prime minister of Georgia, Irakli Garibashvili, where a foreign official approached him and discussing the sort of opening up a second front to join the war in Ukraine. And Irakli asked, how long do you think Georgia could hold out for if we did open a second front? And the official replied, this is some kind of high-ranking official from a country we don't know. And the official replied, 3 to 4 days. And so Irakli asks, so you want to destroy our country for 3 or 4 days? And the official says, yeah, but there's like 3 million of you. You won't all die. You can then change your tactics and go into a guerrilla warfare style, and then we can support you through that. And so they, after this incident, Bidzina claims that the Georgian Dream sort of team, they became much more aware of what was going on, that there was these forces, they're pulling Georgia into war. They became much more stern, more aggressive, but he says in a positive way. And we're realizing they had to be very careful in how they wade in these waters of wars also happening in the Middle East now, and that there were forces that are trying to pull Georgia into a war. And this also was the reason that they now want to go after United National Movement, because they believe until now that the war in Ukraine has opened up their eyes about the like malevolent role that UNM played, that they betrayed Georgia. They had signed some documents refers to, he says they have this big report, they have a closed case of how the 2008 war was started through external pressure, and that UNM had signed documents and shows that they started a war with Russia for whoever was ordering them to do it. And that now, because of the similar situation of attempting to pull Georgia back into the war against Russia, that now it's become incredibly important to have this, what he refers to as Nuremberg trials, so then people can see and finally get rid of UNM, which is dictated by outside forces. and they have no problem with sacrificing Georgians for wider like geopolitical games of whoever is, think we can kind of figure out who are the people that want to start a war with Russia and use Georgia as a front. So that was I thought that was I mean, we had already heard about this through like sort of rumors and stuff that I had already heard about that this is something like this had happened. But another one that was even more explosive, I thought, was that, this idea that there's been a lot of talk around his money being frozen, de facto he's sanctioned, and so on, which was a little bit confusing for me. I kept trying to figure out what was exactly happening. And he discussed how the banks froze his account after the Russian invasion of Ukraine without any reason to. He's not under sanctions, nothing. They just froze his money. It took him a year and a half through courts to unfreeze like one bank account, and then there's another debate. There's another conflict with Credit Suisse, and he said that, look, and he was very like, look, I'm going to make you decide, but what does it look like when you freeze my accounts, and then you tell me to come to a meeting about Georgia? He felt like that was like an extortion kind of thing, where they were using his personal finances as collateral to get him to get concessions, political concessions about Georgia. And he said, because of this, I refuse to meet with any politicians. I said, first unfreeze my accounts. That way I'm free to speak with you. Because otherwise, this will be like you're holding my money sort of hostage to get to agree to whatever they're trying to get them to agree to. And he says that he has emails of this writing to the US ambassador saying, I'm not trying to be rude, I'm not trying to be arrogant, that I'm too good to meet with you. It's just that under these conditions, this is not something I want to do. And he says after now he has settled all the banking, unfreezing, and so on, he's gotten his money back. And now he's ready to meet as a free person and not under some kind of duress. And he said the Credit Suisse, like, until the last moment, they were trying to get him to not give his money back. Like, he says the court ordered deadline. They waited till last minute, paying exorbitant fees like every single day. They were willing to pay up tons of money to keep him from getting access to his money. So he thinks all of this was like a political nature. He makes a good case, I think. I mean, good to hear from you. So he kind of reverts that, like people keep saying that you're using your personal interest over the country. He says actually it's the opposite. They were trying to use my own personal finances to get me to make decisions about the country. And then he's also is this very like, oh, we love the US. It's always our priority, and hopefully we can work it out. We have a scheduled meeting with the US ambassador. Let's rebuild our friendship, our relationship, and so on. And that that this war, and it's something that we've all been saying, is this war has changed everything. Changed relationships, showed us different things. Turned everything upside down. And until this war is over, he says, we're always in danger. Not even just the elections. But this war is what's not only just this war, but also Middle Eastern wars that are also waging. That this is putting Georgia in a very dangerous situation, and we have to be very vigilant. Sorry, it took me forever to say that. Go. Any comments?
Yes, actually, this was a quite revealing interview for many, because Georgian public, especially a lot of Georgians who have actually fought against Saakashvili's regime, we used to discuss the same talking points as Ivanishvili used for the 2008 war. Therefore, we were always thinking and trying to understand why Georgian Dream has not been addressing these issues, particularly 2008 war. But now, after also winning the court case against Russia in Europe in Strasbourg, if I'm not mistaken. Bidzina said that now they're ready to do this. They are willing to take actions against the UNM, especially also considering the 2022 Russian invasion in Ukraine and Ukrainians, former officials of Ukraine, for example, Hornachenko, who was openly suggesting for Georgian government to open up a second front. This is not an open secret. This is a public statement that was made by Hornachenko and also the military advisors, even Arestovich. He also said that Georgia needs to open up a second front, and therefore Ukraine and Georgia could attack Russia, and Georgia can reclaim those territories that have been lost. Therefore, we in Georgian public, at least a section of Georgian public, we had the same understanding of a given situation regarding the Ukraine and the second front. The Georgian Dream officially did not say anything for some time. In addition to this all, what we are now seeing is that it is elections, there are going to be elections in several days, and therefore Georgian Dream might be also using this anti-UNM rhetoric in order to mobilize the anti-UNM voters as well. So there's two things. Yes, it might be real, what happened, because we all had a feeling what was going on. The part of the Georgians that were critical of UNM and the Western interventions and their open positions and their impositions on Georgia. And now at the same time, Georgian Dream has decided to offer this to be their main campaign promise to tackle the question of the Saakashvili's party and the collective UNM. At the same time, Ivanishvili also talked about how they were also pressuring Georgia to sanction Russia, and the parties that are actually promising the 1,000 lari pensions for the pensioners, it would be unfeasible because our dependency on the Russian economy and our dependency on our neighbors. These are the takeaways that I've made, but at the same time, there is also one really important thing I think we should address. His take on China and how it is important to have the Chinese investments for the Anaklia port, that the Lelo leader, Hazaradze, former banker and the TBC Bank founder, has made a statement that if he is in charge of the country, he would reclaim the Anaklia port and he would kick out the Chinese and bring in Western investments. However, Bidzina Ivanishvili was saying that that was stupid because the only way to have a corridor, to have a hub, economic hub, is to bring in the Chinese investments to make it more lucrative, in a way to have this port functioning. And he was like, I'm a businessman, and I thought these people were financiers or business people, and I don't understand their rationale behind this, behind their politics. Yeah. And also, I would like to add one little thing. I know quite a lot. It was about his take on former Prime Minister Gacharia and how he was very much angry on Gacharia, and also saying that Gacharia was the person who was willing to sign the action against Russia, and if he stayed in power, he would be very much willing to sacrifice the Georgian interests and the interests of the Georgian people to go after Russia in order to gain the favors of the Western imperialist palace. Okay.
Maybe I could make like one comment about what Rezi said about Anaklia Port and Hazaradze's comment. That's interesting because Anaklia Port and this seaside resorts and ports used to be like a joint project between Hazaradze and Georgian Dream, and it used to be their like a pet project, let's say, and they worked on it a lot. And that's very interesting because Hazaradze apparently, well, before forming his own oppositional party, he used to be pro-GD. Well, at least to an extent. I don't know to what extent he was, but definitely he had some conflicts with the previous government, the UNM government. So when the GD came to power, he was actually very pro-GD because, GD itself is very pro-big business, and there is no pro-bigger business than Khazaradze other than, Ivanishvili in Georgia. So when the whole Anaklia port thing failed, that's when the split started between Khazaradze and the Georgian Dream. And then, there was also the thing with Tbilisi Bank, and that's when Khazaradze created his own party and coalition, which he created to actually protect his own business, not to, do anything actual political. So yeah, that's and it's Bidzina Ivanishvili's comment is actually quite funny that he says that, oh, I'm a businessman and I thought you guys were businessmen as well, because initial falling out that Khazaradze had with Georgian Dream is that this Anaklia port thing was not very lucrative. He was not getting the money that he invested. But now, as a leader of a political party, he is proposing to make a plan that will be not as lucrative as, for example, what Chinese offered us. So he became what he quote unquote hated, and he became the thing that, he started a political party against. So that's very interesting how Khazaradze went back to square one on this journey. Well, he also made some other interesting comments about Khazaradze's party, but I think Rezi also said that the thing about 1,000 lari pensions, it's about Khazaradze's party promise that absolutely every party made fun of. And Ivanishvili said that with Russian sanctions on Russia, not only 1,000, they will not be able to pay 100 lari to our pensioners. So yeah, that's very interesting.
Just to add one thing, actually, there's a rumor that Khazaradze started a party to enter the parliament in order to get an immunity from police and persecution, because there's a court case against him and how he sort of mishandled the Anaklia port, and there's a huge court case against him where if he would have been found guilty, if he was found guilty, he would have ended up in jail. Therefore, he needed to become a member of the parliament. So that is that also needs to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, Brian, did you have any comment? I have other comments.
I was just going to say that, the other day I watched 20-minute long rally of Strong Georgia Coalition. And it was interesting because literally, I think it was like 15 minutes of talking about the Anaklia port. And then next to that, this idea about the 1,000 lari pension. And it was just really funny because it's clearly like the personal political vendetta of Khazaradze, but also shows he was very like obsessive about this Anaklia port, and I just wanted to add that. And also the other thing I wanted to mention, sorry, really quickly about the Bidzina Ivanishvili speech. I don't have much to say about it, but I think his comments about NATO were very interesting, because he looked at the very difficult position that Georgia found itself in after the 2008 NATO summit, where NATO did not want Ukraine and Georgia to become members, but there were a few states, the United States, Poland, and a few others, who pushed through the resolution to give them guaranteed membership eventually, but not a membership action plan. And I think that this is important to remember because he used this to discuss the very difficult conditions that Ukraine is in, where essentially the collective West is relying on this proxification of Ukraine to fight this war, or so that NATO doesn't have to. And it was very interesting framing, because I think most people misunderstand the use for NATO to have states like Georgia and Ukraine, who are not members, will not have the Article 5 guarantee of being protected, will not be able to have kind of the benefits of full membership, but then can still be materially useful to them in lives, and in territory and in other things. And I think it's important to remember that the EU has similar relationships to states. So worth remembering that. I think he made a true point when he mentioned that.
So other things I thought was very important. He discusses how, well, there's interesting with the LGBT part, which he was like, he's pretty much like, I don't care if you're gay or not, you know. I and this is where I thought was really interesting in the sense that, I mean, this is clearly a man who, I don't think he has any personal, you know, kind of anti-gay outlook, but he's someone who's earnestly engaging with a lot of conservative talking points. You know, like, so this is what I got was like, it's this kind of like a backlash conservative movement that's taking hold in the US and so on. And so those things seem to make sense to him. So he's like, he doesn't seem like this very ideological the way they are in the US about it. He seemed very much like, oh, this is like common sense. Like, he's like, oh, I'm totally for, you know, gay people, anti-discrimination law. And he's like, look, UNM didn't even have the audacity to introduce something like that. And he's like, it took me a long time. Like, it was very difficult to even get this passed because people were against it, you know? So he's like, I forced, you know, this anti-discrimination law on Georgia that they probably didn't want. But I draw the line in so-called propaganda. And so he looks at it as, and again, this is where it gets like very like blurry because there's so much of these cultural wars all the time in the US, you know, it's like 24/7 about this stuff. He uses a lot of the examples about the schools and so, and toilets or whatever, like this main talking points in the West. And he thinks it's like a Pandora's box that if you open this, you know, like if it's just like, oh, it's just a pride, it's just a nice festival, you know, whatever, that it will lead to all of these other nonstop focus on gender and sexuality. And like, and he describes like, you know, pride as some like orgies on the streets and so on. So he's like, if we allow this, then all of these other things will come. And one thing like I found interesting is like, then he says that if you are someone who's confused about your gender identity and this is your focus and you change or whatever, that you are then easily manipulated. That becomes your entire like focus. And you also forget about your ancestor, who you came from, like every other part of identity that might be more interesting than just your gender and your sexuality. So then he pulls out this book. It's like a dystopia novel. I was like looking into it. I think it's like getting the rounds, like it's become another kind of Orwell, but for like the conservatives. It was like, I think it's called 2001, 2100 or something like that. I think it's by Thea Alexander. And so he's like, this book is like, you know, clearly has an impact on him about how he sees all this sort of liberalism playing out in this kind of with his gender and sexuality. So he's, again, it seemed very earnest, his engagement. I just think he should be reading better things as well. It's like, and so with this, he clearly, I mean, society is very, you know, homophobic. Of course, like it shows, like I was just looking at, you know, a 2021 study around the attitudes around homosexuality, and it was like 10% are somewhat or fully in agreement of gay marriage. That means 90% is against it, you know, like, and was so strongly against it. It was like 60 or 70% strongly against it. And so there's like all this, Georgian society already has a lot of tendency to also view any kind of LGBT activism for like rights or so on as propaganda. Like they see it not as trying to attain like a full citizenship in society, but as propaganda. So you have this base, and you know, before he even pushed this base to adopt certain anti-discrimination laws that was like against their whatever their values. But he's definitely leaning into, we have to build a country around this idea of unity. If you're going to have all these sort of different members vying for all these different kinds of sort of rights, or not even just rights, but like certain their own sort of special interests, that you're not going to have like a coherent society, you know? And then it makes other parts of society kind of uncomfortable and causes backlash. So he's like, I don't want this to be this like turn Georgia into sort of cultural war kind of thing that's happening in the West. That's how I see it.
One thing
Yeah,
that I think it's maybe important to add is that I do think that the tone on sort of like LGBT things was quite different than in other places, and I think that maybe that why that's the case is something that needs to be examined, because I think that on the one hand there's a difference between when anybody in any political party is trying to kind of like mobilize certain segments of the society and mobilize their base through the instrumentalization of these culture war issues like LGBT, and then kind of a different intention with the more nuanced and measured and like reflective and nuanced view of these questions. So I think it's like important not, to see like when and how and why these different approaches are taken, because I think we see all politicians do that, right? They don't just speak in the same tone or with the same kind of intention in every speech they give.
Yeah, actually, his tone wasn't mocking or anything like that, too, which I found very interesting, because like a lot of anti-gay politicians make a lot of mocking kind of statements a lot, or the kind of shaming, and he was very, very like in his own way, like very kind of objective, trying to understand it better, attempt to make sense of it. He felt like that was the fact that he was most prepared and brought the book for that question. He felt like he was trying to take it seriously in his own way, right? I'm not sure how much more serious ways, but so I felt like he was really trying to be like sensitive about this issue in his interpretation. I found the strongest part that I liked the most was that he was like, don't aspire to be, we don't strive for Europe. We don't strive for the Russia. We strive for us. Like, I thought that was the strongest message that resonated. That he's like, why do they keep saying they're taking, like the opposition saying, we're going to take you to Europe and Bidzina's going to take you to Russia. He's like, this is a preposterous commentary, because he's like, we've done most for any kind of European values. They think just because they're going to agree to everything the EU says to them, that they're going to get to Europe. And he's like, that's just not true. They're not going to accept you just because you're going to reverse all the laws I made. So that was very good. And he's like, as far as what is attractive about Europe, he's like, we are doing the best in those things. Like, of course, he talks about like private property, business, equal playing field, individual rights, whatever. He's like, we are on top of all the ratings when it comes to this. He's like, we have mastered European values better than the Europeans have. It's like, for us, that's what the value is, not a territorial thing. And he's like, to say that we are somehow not European and the opposition will take you there, it's just like, it's absurd. And so I like that it was a focus that I felt that again was like earnest in that. It was like, let's build like Georgia, And he says like, look, I love Ukraine. I fully support them. I think it's horrible what's happening, but I don't want to go to Europe like that. Like, that's not what I want Georgian future to be like. I want us to enter Europe our head held high. And so that I felt that was the strongest part about his many messages he said, but I thought that was the one that resonated the most with me. And I mean, in the whole like hour and a half, whatever it was, I don't remember. Like, it was nice that he completely changed the entire framework around this obsession with Russia, this Russia thing, because it like, it's something that we've said continuously, like this is not about Russia. Like this, they have made everything around Russia, and we're gonna discuss like every single get out the vote is about they're taking us to Russia and so on and so on. But like Georgian Dream is a very interesting case in the sense of Georgia's an interesting case that in this country, it's really just pro-West force. I mean, like pro-West against pro-West. It's like in other countries, I think in Moldova and whatever, I think there really is explicitly pro-Russian like parties. They're like, yeah, like they're much more open about it. Like Georgia's really not that way. And he said something very interesting. He said, it's kind of a rough translation. He said, look, because of our geography, we've had to accommodate great powers, he calls it genetic like memory or genetic experience. He's like, and he pretty much said to US, like, we will accommodate you, but we won't do it at the expense of completely killing our country. So it was a quite interesting kind of pragmatic approach, and also like a signal, but also saying there's a red line to how much we can accommodate you.
Yes, absolutely. And also considering the polling where we're going to discuss Moldova, we can see how different the attitudes are in the political establishments and how unfair the European Union has been treating us. And they're trying to punish actually pro-Western government not being pro-Western enough in a way. Yeah.
Okay. Next topic, Europe March. Commentary on the message that Salome Zurabishvili talked about during the march. Did anyone actually listen, watch? I listened, I watched, I wrote a whole Substack on it, all the different commentaries, politicians.
One thing I just kind of want to point out is that, she made these. There's a lot of things that were said in this EU March, Euro March. Obviously, the Euro March was clearly not as big as I think some people had hoped or expected, which was interesting. I don't know if that's a sign or if that just is people are tired. I'm not sure, but that was interesting. And the second thing is that in this moment of like polarization, it's funny that you've got Salome Zurabishvili up there mentioning that she's giving praise to Ukraine and Moldova, two countries that Georgia should try to avoid becoming for different reasons, as though they're kind of embodying the kind of like Europeanness. And I think that is an interesting way in which the two political forces of the state and the broader like opposition forces, as they're like trying to put out their narratives. I actually think when you put the Bidzina discussion versus how the opposition is starting to present themselves, the opposition is getting into this much narrower corner, unable to actually have a vision of what some kind of European Georgia means outside of doing what the EU wants or becoming Ukraine and Moldova, whereas I think other more broader ideas about what some European Georgia would mean sit in other corners. So I think that was interesting to see.
The other thing with Salome Zurabishvili is that these pro-European marches are generally very vague. What they're saying is, we will take you to Europe, unlike the Georgian Dream. They do not actually have any vision, any strategy, how to build the country, how the process will affect Georgia, what is the vision of development within Europe or within the process of acquis communautaire, where we have to do the reforms, etc. And I think one of the biggest reasons why many people didn't actually show up is because Salome Zurabishvili herself, who was saying that she would be the leader of the depolarization after the 2021 local elections, has been actually steering up more and more polarization in the country and helping to split the country. At the same time, she's a very unpopular figure. She barely won the elections in 2018, and she won the elections because of the Georgian Dream and because Bidzina Ivanishvili personally got involved. And she in the first round of the votes, she won only 8% over the UNM Vashadze. However, the idea that Salome Zurabishvili now is trying to sort of revive her career to become the leader, I think she's vying to become the unified leader of the opposition, where she was promising the pro-EU rally Georgian activists that she would be in charge of creating this technical government that we discussed before. I think she really tries to portray herself so that someone is from Europe. Actually, she comes from France. She's not Georgian. I mean, she is genetically Georgian, but she's like ethnically Georgian, sorry. But she was brought up in France. She got her education, her career, political, everything started from France. And she's very much, milking these European, pro-European and Eurocentrist hegemony in the country. And now she's trying to do that. And I don't think that this March for Europe or anything has actually given anything new to the Georgian public. It was just to march with the EU flags, and I saw more EU flags than the Georgian flags too. And after this march, then you had the interview with Bidzina Ivanishvili that, from my perspective, even weakened the position of the pro-EU march and opposition and Salome Zurabishvili's positions even more. And because logically speaking, the opposition and the Salome Zurabishvili's team and the NGOs actually do not offer anything tangible. And what they are trying to do is they're trying to toy with the emotions of the Georgian people. That's all. That's all. Pure and plain.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make a small comment that despite the fact that life in Georgia definitely has its problems, I'm so happy that I live in Georgia and not in Moldova or Ukraine, which is definitely much more worse than living here. So her comparing us to either Moldova or Ukraine, it's just funny considering the fact that Moldova actually is less pro-European than Georgia is. So I mean, she paid her homage to like Sandumaya and Zelensky, and out of those three, I think despite the fact that we have a better situation here, I think her career is ending the first. Sandumaya has a chance of getting reelected. Zelensky will at least, push through however long this war will go through. But yeah, her career on the other hand, it's ending. I don't think that, especially if the Georgian Dream will win, there's no way that she'll remain relevant in the politics at all. And even if the opposition win, which can actually happen, it's not really clear that Salome Zurabishvili will stay relevant in the politics unless, France will put down its foot and, like intervene into Georgia on Salome's behalf, I don't really think that will happen. So, yeah, her career is definitely at the end, and that's why she's trying to go out and meet, like young people. Now her target audience is young people. Like 4 years ago, she didn't even care about young people. Now it's all about young people because she's, the image of a pro-EU president. So she has to go out to all of these protests and meetings and whatever they are and make a speech about, condemning or commending Sandumaya and Zelensky and EU and whatever. But despite all the tricks that she does, I don't think her career will last long. I think we're seeing the end of Salome Zurabishvili.
I think that this brings up an interesting point because we're connecting this Euro march to Moldova, and maybe we can go into this discussion about the Moldova elections. But it brings up the point that oftentimes the EU, let's take the Moldova example, is presented as and I think this has resonance among some people in Georgia, some of the electorate and some of the population, the EU representing, progress, social transformation, democracy. But in a country like Moldova, where there's a huge segment of the population that openly rejects joining the EU, how can the process of EU accession actually overcome the kind of inherent political polarization of the country instead of exacerbating it? Because it seems to me that in the Moldovan case, what you have is basically a recipe for further polarization and potentially war, right? When not actually some resolution to it. I think in the Georgian context, as you guys have already outlined in different ways, the fault lines are different. But I also think that this long, drawn out, and basically unending process of being an EU candidate member, slowly but surely moving towards some, promised land of the European Union, has the same effect, where essentially it breeds polarization in these different ways, because you're never going to have a unified kind of like national coherent political orientation towards the EU as it wishes existed in Georgia. And so I think the EU, and as other people have mentioned, needs to have some coming to terms with the limits of its own process of trying to expand, because it's clearly not actually working in these countries that are being brought into this these given candidate status or undergoing the process of trying to join. It's actually increasing forms of polarization. And I think, of course, this could have serious consequences in this era of war, geopolitical shifts, new economic connections, and U.S. Geopolitical competition with China and Russia. So it's something that needs to be very carefully critiqued and analyzed.
Yes. I found the whole march, and I was like listening to different politicians make comments. I mean, they were definitely very much like, oh, well, we're winning. Look at all the people out here. And I mean, honestly, it's a big crowd. Like, I didn't mock the size at all. Like, as somebody who's organized many rallies, 5 people sometimes come out to. I'm very much, I'm generous with crowd sizes. So I think Salome's message, like, I thought this was the most disturbing part about it. So I think you start off, great, like, oh, my grandson was born and it's a new world and stuff. But I was thinking, yeah, Salome, it is a new world, just not the way you think. But she says, today here is the Georgia of tomorrow and yesterday. When I say yesterday, not the one that was sunk in the Soviet clutches, but the free Georgia of our ancestors and honorable history. That Georgia and this Georgia are one and both will enter Europe together. I want to address our partners, Europeans and Americans. I want to tell them that we will be such a partner and ally that you cannot even dream of when we enter Europe. And it's like, this was one of the crazier ones. It's like, she literally said, oh, if you pick us, we will be your best support. We'll be your cheerleaders. Like, you will never have anyone more loyal and more on your side and do everything than we will. It was like a child, like begging daddy or something, like, it was really embarrassing. That part was really cringe, like so cringe. And it's weird because this is her message, right? She's kind of forged herself as the authority on the opposition. This is her message to Europe versus Bidzina's messages. We'll walk into Europe on our own terms with our held head high. I'm confused to how can anyone look at those two messages, like, if you don't take other factors into account, and be like, I like the Salome version. Like, let's beg them. We'll tell them we'll do anything for them. Like, who would be for that? Like, that's so embarrassing and degrading as a Georgian. Like, I'm offended by this, It was like I had the same kind of feeling when I was going to like pro-immigration rallies in the US, and I got very angry with the organizers because their entire messaging to Americans was, who's going to clean your toilets? Who's going to do your nails if you throw out immigrants? And I was like offended, like, excuse me, like, you should give us like, right to work in the US because you want someone to clean your toilets and like get your nails done, Like, this is the message, not because we're human beings and have dignity. And I was very angry with the organizers of this rally and just that messaging in general. And it's like, I feel like this is the same messaging coming from the French president, who's like very like sophisticated and, very Parisian. This woman has the same mentality as like, oh, like we will be your slaves, just let us in. And it's like, I don't know, it's offensive to me. However,
It's humiliating.
yeah, go
It's
ahead.
humiliating. It's humiliating for me as a Georgian who lived in this country for 30 years and strived to how to improve the conditions and the lives of my fellow citizens, especially the working class, that it was also humiliating that Georgian Dream chose her because she was European and born in France. It was humiliating. And they did not give us other choice but to support her because the other one was crazy, UNM. And what I see is this Salome Zurabishvili is Georgian on a paper. She is a colonizer. She is a colonizer mentality who speaks on behalf of Georgia and who is openly offering the vassalage of Georgia to the Western imperialist powers. It was absolutely degrading, and I got extremely angry, and I felt personally berated and rebuked by her actions. I do not understand the people who actually would support her messaging or who understood it and who then think that they are patriots of the country, who are actually fighting for the liberation of the country. And if you support that messaging, you are on the very wrong side of the history, my friends. And I'm very angry on that. Sorry.
What's interesting was that like all the politicians like that I was listening to opposition politicians like kept saying everyone who's here came on their own free will. They weren't forced to, like, allegedly Georgian Dream is forcing people to go to their protest, but not here. Everyone's free to come because freedom, that's the best thing ever is freedom. And so while they're saying that they're not slaves like Georgian Dream and all the supporters are being forced to go to protests, then they're like, please accept us into Europe, we'll be your slaves. So it's like, they really have no coherent worldview, I think, in general. Their only coherent worldview is Europe is powerful and strong, and we just have to do whatever they say. We'll make any kind of promise. We'll go along with anything they tell us. And anyone who opposes that, we will degrade as slaves and whatever. And it's like, I don't know, it was just so bad. And then they kept on purpose. I think every single politician was, dropping hints or outright saying that Georgian Dream is going to rig the elections. It's like, and they are authoritarian and they have to respect the will of the people, and their, opposition is definitely going to win. And so they're setting up, the groundwork that this is going to be a rigged election to then have the, what's the word, the reasons for whatever's going to happen afterwards. What's interesting, which I forgot to mention that we should have talked about, is that yesterday, 13 countries, foreign ministers, sent a letter to Georgia, which is a ridiculous letter. I mean, I try to be objective and try to like understand it, but how could you write such a letter and call literally just Georgian Dream are delusional and dishonest? Because if they
One interesting thing,
you like
one
this,
interesting,
like, yeah.
one interesting thing that no, it was a very ridiculous letter, but one interesting thing about it was, there are subtle fractures inside of the EU about the approach that states should be taking towards Georgia, even Ukraine, Russia. I mean, all kinds of foreign policy questions. And you see this, I mean, in some ways, of course, when these EU resolutions that are lambasting Georgia for so-called democratic backsliding, those kinds of resolutions have some dissent, but it's been interesting to see that they couldn't get all of the EU member state foreign ministers to even sign this letter. And I think that is like, I'm not saying that then represents a huge paradigm shift, but the one thing that I think it's important for everybody to keep in mind, and I want to use this to make a bigger point, which is that the EU is going through shifts, and the way that the Ukraine war ends or continues is going to really dramatically change how states perceive and approach and view their own foreign policy interests. So certain states, for example, Poland, which has the most strong military in the entire European Union and only getting stronger, is going to naturally try and throw its own perception and views of Russia and the Ukraine conflict onto the rest of the Union, while states like Spain are probably, regardless of their rhetorical or even material support of Ukraine, are likely to have a different set of priorities. And so we should watch to see how that dynamic continues and then affects the thinking of Georgian elites, both in the opposition forces and in the state currently.
Okay, should we just move on to Moldova elections as well, since it has to do with this? Rezi, go ahead.
Yes.
So the thing is that it's very much connected to Georgia, because Georgian opposition and also the European Union was praising Moldova and how is Moldova more pro-EU and how Moldova is actually implementing more pro-EU reforms and how Moldovan people are more cheering for the European Union. However, the Sunday's referendum proved to be wrong, because only 50% of the people actually voted for Moldova to have a constitution line saying that Moldova should become part of the European Union. The extremely nervous Sunday, and especially Monday night for Maya Sandu, the current president, lead us to several conclusions at once, which are important to discuss in order to understand the reasons for what happened and try to predict its consequences. Firstly, presidential teams bat on referendum as a way to mobilize its pro-EU supporters, to force them to come to the polls, even if they are not delighted with the results of Maya Sandu's first-term presidential term has failed. Yes, the referendum part of the voted yes apparently ended up with marginal and a very dubious victory for the option yes, especially after the against option was in the lead throughout the whole count. It's and what it showed is that there is no unanimous perception of if there's no unanimity in the Moldovan society if they want to go for Europe. Secondly, the borderline referendum result sends a very strong political signal to the European Union. There are already plenty of opponents of the EU expansion at the expense of Moldova. Of course, the EU would not suddenly stop all cooperation with Moldova. However, there is a clear line and a clear signal that Chișinău, unlike Tbilisi, is not that willing to have a full-on cooperation and unanimity to cooperate with Moldova. Thirdly, the results shown by Sandu and her referendum is difficult to interpret as anything other than the evidence of President's weakness in the domestic political arena that is never addressed by the European Union and the EU officials, especially it's never transmitted or broadcasted in the Georgian media. And this is before the critically important parliamentary elections that will happen in summer 2025. And it will be very difficult for the pre-EU forces to actually attain the majority or even plurality in the Moldovan parliament to build or to have to be able to have the majority for forming the government. Additionally, the election showed the Moldovan voter approached this very pragmatically. Sandu tried to draw him or her emotions. It was all about emotions. Sandu in pro-EU rallies, like Salome Zurabishvili did, it was built all about emotions. It does not matter. They never addressed economic and social consequences or geopolitical consequences. And considering that there's also another region within Moldova, Autonomous Republic of Gagauzia, who are mostly Christian Ottoman Turks that are living in the southern part of Moldova, they actually voted 98% against joining the EU. So they're saying that if the Moldovans want to join the EU, we do not want to join the EU. That is also another dangerous point where the Gagauzins might start thinking about seceding. And like Transnistria, Moldova might also face another breakaway region and other potential conflict there. And unfortunately, Moldova's economic successes are questionable for the majority of the Moldovan people. Fight against corruption that all these liberals are talking about was really ineffective. And the main thing is that the rapprochement with Europe is all about emotions. There is no real plan also in Moldova, like in Georgia, like the Georgian liberals, the government and the pro-EU liberals in Moldova do not really offer anything tangible. And the voter turnout is more to be inclined to evaluate the real achievement of the president. The state wallet and the number of high-ranking corrupt officials behind bars, and etc., etc. And at the same time, there's a big questions that are raised by Moldovans, because Moldovans were very pragmatic. It's about the salaries, the pensions, and almost free gas that they're actually receiving from Russia. And also Moldova is still a member of the CIA, as the Commonwealth of Independent States, that Ukraine and Georgia are not members anymore. And that is the former Soviet republics that are actually more or less going around the Russian sphere of influence. And the biggest factor, one of the most questionable thing that I think could be another potential reason for future turmoil is the results and how the diaspora votes actually affected the results. Of course, this shows that there's a gap between the Moldovans that actually live in the country and the Moldovans that actually live abroad. However, it also gives a reason to think, what would the results of the referendum have been if there had been not just 2 polling stations for the whole Russia, and there are 300,000 Moldovans living in Russia. And both of these polling stations were open in Moscow, not even Petersburg, but there were 17 in the United States and 50 in Italy. And these makes, I think these need to be addressed, and these also bring up questions, because the votes that came, around 95% when it was counted, the no vote was leading. And after these votes came in from the Western countries, for diaspora votes, the vote shifted to around 50.1% in favor. So it's basically 0.3% difference in margin between yes and no. So this is a very much a toss-up election that is very questionable, considering also the polling stations that have not been opened in Russia. And yes, the stated reasons for small number of polling stations is Chisinau's inability also to secure the process. And also, at the same time, it's very funny because Maya Sandu, when their team was very enthusiastic and we're saying that we're going to win this, landslide, etc. Suddenly, when they saw that Maya Sandu was not able to win in the first round, and she now needs a second round, that will be presidential elections held on November 3rd, if I'm not mistaken. Suddenly, Maya Sandu started using the famous Hillary Clinton and Democrat reasoning, Russian intervention. And they opened 2 polling stations in Russia, and suddenly there's all about Russian intervention. You can judge by yourself. So these are the things that actually transpired in Moldova, more or less, and the yes vote won, but it's still a toss-up from my. What do you think about it, guys?
What do you all think?
I still have the kind of broader question, which is that when you have a society like Moldova, in which parts of the country genuinely want to be, if not in the EU, want to have good relations with Russia, what is a political arrangement that actually works? And I think that this is the way that people need to start thinking, at least in the Moldova case, to avoid the trajectory that we've seen unfold in Ukraine, where the outcome that the country has now is far worse than it could have been had, say, the Minsk agreements or some other kind of federal arrangement or political concessions to the east of Ukraine had been given. And then what does this mean for EU, let alone NATO, Russia relations? And I think that there needs to be some soul searching and some really serious discussions about what kinds of alternative political arrangements can work, because it seems that, again, this kind of push and civilizational fight that is ideologically presented in these countries as being one of forward or backward isn't going to lead to the results that either the pro-European or the so-called pro-Russian sides of these societies want. And so, what kinds of other political arrangements can mitigate this problem? And I don't have a good answer, but it's something I'm thinking a lot about with these Moldova results, because even though this EU referendum seems to have squeezed out Sandu's potential to win is not guaranteed, that's not going to actually overcome the deeper problem of the inherent polarization of the society, not to mention Moldova's the poorest country in Europe and the intractable economic problems that the country still has not been able to overcome. I don't know, Gio, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear that the elections were not the elections. I mean, the referendum was completely unfair. In any kind of fair situation where either they would completely get rid of diaspora votes, or on the other way around, they would, consider every diaspora vote. It's clear that the referendum result would be no, that the Moldovan people do not want to join EU, and that's why they had to do all those machinations to exclude all the people who live in Russia, which I'm sure that they don't even consider them as humans, let alone people who deserve to vote. I mean, on top of that, Maya Sandu's comments were quite disturbing she started tweeting aggressively in the middle of the night when she realized the fact that, because she thought that 75% of the people would vote yes. I don't know if it's her personal delusions or she was lying about it, but I mean, apparently she did think about it. But in the middle of the night, it was quite clear that the no faction was definitely winning. They had like 55% of the vote when they counted already like 95% of every vote. So she started tweeting aggressively. She started saying how these thugs were disturbing the referendum, and how whatever the Russian influence was strong inside of Moldova, and this referendum. She almost started like taking the referendum back before they started counting the diaspora votes, which is funny because who are the thugs for her? People who vote for elections, and people who just show what they actually think, that those are the thugs. And she talks about, and other liberals in Moldova, they talked about how there's a lot of Russian money in Moldova, which I don't even doubt. But on the other hand, then we have EU who's investing huge amount of money and giving out lots of grants to Moldovan government, Moldovan NGOs, especially after this whole thing with Georgia started, that the conflict between the Georgian Dream and EU. EU started prioritizing Moldova as a punishment for Georgian Dream. So I mean, there might be Russian influence and Russian money, but there's as much, if not more, EU influence. But even with that, even with all of those influence and money and grants, people still, like, if we're actually talking about reality, they still voted against joining EU. So in my eyes, this referendum is basically null and void because it's completely unfair. But about Maya Sandu, I don't know if she'll be reelected. It's like she definitely had the worst day in her life. She technically lost the referendum, and she lost the elections, and now she has to do the second round. God knows if she will win or not, because people might rally against her. So yeah, it was definitely the worst day of her political life.
I think one thing to add just really quickly is that, since 2014, there has been this shift in the European Union, right? The annexation of Crimea, the ramping up of fighting in eastern Ukraine, the Syrian civil war and refugee crisis, and then the invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent war, which has turned the EU into this more you had this geopolitical pivot, which many people have written about. And one thing that you see is that this simultaneously encouraged the EU to give candidate status to Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia without extending those candidacy statuses due to simply reform metrics alone. And so what's going on is that the EU is, because of this more pronounced geopolitical posture, you're actually seeing a situation where the EU is presenting itself, like in Moldova, more as a geopolitical choice than actually something that has to do with the fractures and the desires, the wants, or the daily life of people in Moldova. And so I think that that is actually having this dual effect where it's encouraging the EU to be more aggressive, but it's also presenting itself as this geopolitical bloc in a moment when countries and citizens want to avoid being dragged into, I think, this potentially deadly geopolitical competition. And so you see how it's like having this kind of like the EU is kind of having this self-undermining effect. And that's like just from an analytical standpoint, not a reflection of how I feel about the EU, but I'm just saying that it's having this like self-undermining effect, I think.
I don't know a lot about Moldova. I am going by certain things, but I think what's interesting is that Moldova, like many other countries, some in the EU, some outside of EU, if you look at who's actually kind of successful in the EU, it's like Poland, it's Hungary, right? Countries that actually had resources and a party that wanted to create a state and have a national interest, they're the ones who are successful, more or less, when they're in the EU. And those also are the countries successful outside of the EU. I get the sense from Moldova, Maya especially, and the opposition of Georgia, similar vibes, is that they have no real intention. They know Georgia or Moldova can't develop. They just have they don't really understand industrial policy, like have their own national economy. I think that stuff is like, back in the day, it's like an old kind of old fashioned. I think they're like, the best bet we have is just do whatever EU says, give us some grants to create that sort of middle class that stays in Moldova, that stays in Georgia. We go along with whatever they tell us. And then the rest of the people will just go into different countries of Europe. And this will be mostly how they believe that this is our best bet. Like the middle class by grants, and others living within EU countries. So anyone who wants to actually build a country and think about how to grow their economy, have a coherent national state, and so on, would not accept any of these sort of terms that Maya and Georgian opposition would. That it's like a whole different way of thinking. Like, do you want to actually run a country, or do you want to be EU's bureaucrat, viceroy or whatever in an outpost? And I think that's the change. And Georgian Dream used to be like this, I believe. Only the last few years, they've sort of become like, oh, maybe we should run this country, actually. It's like, so this is even worse in the comprador class. That there's still there are still some local middle managers of capital, but this is even more than that. It's worse than that. They're middle managers, bureaucratic managers who are not even capitalists, who are just managers of EU bureaucracy, without even the capital. So EU is starting to look like, and I think this is actually different from, say, 2003, 2004 EU, right? That it's not actually a viable alternative for anyone who wants to build a country. Now, if you want to escape and have visa-free travel and be able to study and work in Europe, yeah, it's your best bet. I mean, yeah, go ahead. Sure. You should then just do that kind of, even if we don't get EU membership, which we probably won't, you can, still have those sort of privileges of just moving and, living in Berlin or whatever. I mean, if that's your life goal, I think choose EU, choose the pro-West side because that will get you there. But I think if you actually want to build a country, that's definitely not the way to go. That's like the sense I'm getting from all this. And a sense I got more from watching the Moldova elections. I was like, okay, this is starting to make sense now. Like it's not just Georgia. So I had to like kind of look up all these things about Moldova and read that I hadn't done before. And so that's, I think, how the situation has unfolded. I think we should move on because we have been talking a long time now. And I think we should discuss different topics as well. Next topic, Georgi, you want to talk about the youth vote, which kind of leans into this, and I will talk about what workers want. We can talk about the youth vote.
Okay, so the conversation about, young people voting is always very hot in Georgia. And for opposition, they made it like a crucial point, especially this year. The opposition's main hope or talking point is that the young people will save the elections. Well, save, what they mean by save. All these like liberal institutions like academia and Georgia media constantly push for the mobilization of young voters to vote for the opposition. And apparently there's a lot of money like, going into this very project, this like a whole ordeal in the matter of the days. I mean, we personally saw a lot of posters, brochures, and all that in different like housing, apartments, like institutions and all that. All of these posters, they usually depict, they're like blue posters with yellow stars, so depicting EU flag, and inside there's a small message that says vote for your first elections, which actually made me feel older because these are my second elections. In the universities, we were given like notebooks for free that said, it showed like 26, so 26th of October, the election day, and it had stars around it, so 26. So a lot of, EU symbolisms when we talk about elections, and the notebook said, go vote for Georgia's future. Which I didn't really take the notebook because, I mean, it was poor quality, but the messaging is there, like in universities, in media, like apartment blocks. I mean, you'll even go to the elevator and the elevator will have some kind of sticker that will say, go vote. But all of these posters always have EU symbolism. So like EU flag or stars or a blue background or whatever it is. And to some degree, I even see this as like hysteria. Like every professor or politician or journalist is talking about how there is a low turnout for amongst the younger Georgians who are typically more pro-EU and anti-GD, as polls have shown, and we covered this in our previous episode as well. And I actually was a firm believer of this notion for a long time myself, and I just wanted to check exactly the voter turnout for amongst Georgian younger Georgians, and there's actually research in 2021 done by McCain Institute that actually showed us that 67% of young people voted in previous parliamentary elections. 67%, that's a really high number. The age is from 18 till 29. More so, actually, percentage is lower in capital than in rural districts, to my surprise. In capital, it was 60% of young Georgians who voted in elections. In rural districts, it's 71% of the young Georgians. And now that I think about it, it shouldn't really be as shocking as it was for me when I first read the actual research, because, I mean, I voted last elections. A lot of my classmates voted last elections. Voting, especially because I'm registered in my village, it's a rural area. Voting there was extremely easy, like I walked down the street for like 5 minutes and I just tossed in my vote and went back home. It was extremely easy. It was extremely, even the people who like didn't really care to vote for any party, they still, it was an election day, so people just went and voted. So then why, this really brings a question, why is there such a strong fear-mongering if young people do in fact vote? Like if we compare statistics, for example, to US or like EU, 67% is actually really high because like US and EU constantly call us, half democracy or illiberal democracy or, unformed democracy. But comparatively, actually, if we exclude 2020 US elections, most of Georgian elections had a higher voter turnout than any of the modern US elections had. I mean, US elections usually have like 55%, 52%, 51%, quite low. I mean, it's on par with Georgia, but they call us the liberal democracy, the unformed democracy, and they're the beacon of democracy. So when we compare the standards, actually the Georgian turnout is quite high. The answer, I think, is quite simple, is that they want more young people to vote because most of them will vote against the current government, and the youth might actually have a stronger role in the elections that we have anticipated before. Another, I think, slightly more awkward explanation that I have is that these people, like members of liberal institutions, they always study Europe, like they always study Europe, what's happening in Europe. So they know that in Europe, young people don't really turn out to vote. So I don't think that they actually check if it's actually correct in Georgia as well. They assume whatever happens in Europe, it's, the same thing happens all over the world. So they say the same things here. So there are like a couple of reasons why they might continue their fear mongering. But as we have it right now, like in 2020 elections, 67% of young people voted. That's a high turnout. And we might expect that even more young people will vote this elections, considering all the fear mongering, all the propaganda or all the campaigns to get people to vote. And getting people to vote, I'm not against it, but I'm against when your poster about going to the polls has EU flag on it and tells you to vote for opposition and not for for example GD. And not only opposition, it's like even the opposition is quite strict. Like you cannot vote for Girchi, you can vote for this, So like they limit the the pool of parties that you can actually vote for. So yeah, that's quite a sad story. But I think we'll see a high turnout of young voters in these elections, and they will vote, pro opposition mostly. But I'm not sure exactly which parties they're going to vote for. Probably maybe like Lelo or something like that, because UNM is not that popular like for the younger generation. But there's also Achali, which aligned itself with Girchi, and Girchi is slightly more popular at least. But yeah, that is harder to tell. But according to the last elections, we'll see some young people voting definitely. Do you guys have any comments?
Yeah, it's like really unfortunate that that almost all the people that teach a lot of young people are so ideological, that they have like a certain kind of understanding of the world. I think that speaks to sort of the weakness that Georgian dream very much is determined by certain contexts or world events. So they never actually thought about creating any kind of alternative institutions that would have different kind of worldview. So it's interesting in that respect. I think, yeah, and the stickers, we see them everywhere and so on, and all these sort of TikToks and so on. I mean, I honestly think that's the problem with when you don't know, like, it's not just the youth, like, no, not a lot of people have a lot of information or context to things. They're very much trapped in a very small kind of vacuum, which everyone reinforces the same ideas. And I think it's easy to be socialized and under social pressure and not really question a lot of things. Like, that's all understandable. Unfortunately, until people go through experiences, sometimes, like they don't know. So I could have told you, like, when Obama got elected in the US, like during that time, like that he was not going to bring all this hope and so on and so on. But like a lot of people who were voting for Obama at the time were convinced that this was the saving moment for the US. After him, during him, we see how they've only gotten lost.
And wait, Sopo, just to add, Sopo, just to add to what you're saying, I also would like to point out that in 2008, when Obama got elected, there was even a small part of the U.S. left that's kind of supported Obama.
Ah,
And I remember very,
shed tears.
and I and I remember very tell a funny story anecdote that there was a group of anarchists and some leftists who went to DC and organized what they called a hope block, which was in support of Obama, right? Which was quite controversial, of course, but like this was sort of this romantic view of redemption and saving that people put onto Obama, which I think those people eventually understood. But it's important to remember that these kinds of things happen.
Exactly. And I think like again, I think until people go through certain experiences, and then I mean, of course, they say hindsight is 2020. I personally, I think if I was 18 or 19, I would be exactly like them. It's like I honestly don't see how I would have thought differently. Um, because I think the social pressure and almost all the ways that young people, including myself, like get information is all very much filled with certain narratives that find it convincing. The only thing is Obama actually did provide this for a lot of especially white people in the US, like this sort of redemption arc. It's and so that was actually hope and inspirational. However, the opposition neither hopeful nor inspirational. They have literally nobody. Salome is the closest thing they have, and they're like slay queen. But really, nobody. They have no. There's no hope, inspiration. This is completely just fear mongering. It's like that. Their Georgian dream is taking us to Russia, and like Russia's bad. So it's pretty much like Putin or this like horrible opposition. And after like what that tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people coming out in the streets, and you literally just have the same old horrible politicians you had 5 years ago. Like this is the hope and inspiration. Like, come on. Um, anyway, and it's gonna suck because if they do win, then all these people will realize that this whole thing was a lie and learn all these powerful lessons and so on and so on. I just think sometimes we should avoid some of the lessons because I've personally learned them many times. So I think like we should, everybody does need to sort of come into experience. Marx has this thing where it says, through struggle, we become fit to rule ourselves. And so I do think that people have to acquire a certain level of consciousness and experiences to come to certain ideas. So it's not like that's actually it was interesting because that's actually what a lot of the Georgian Dream was saying as well. Like they didn't really have these experiences or this level of like knowledge like 5 years ago. It took time for certain things to happen and them to learn quickly what was happening. So yeah, so I think that's going to be a tough lesson, but I think it's not a fun time right now.
Well, on
However,
that,
yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say on that.
Yeah, you go tell us about the report. I forgot.
Yeah, there's a lot to discuss today. This will be elections on Saturday, so this is a longer episode. But I just want to briefly talk about an article that I actually had read, I think in September, but we had been discussing, which was this pre-election assessment mission to Georgia report that was written by Laura Thornton. Laura Thornton is a senior director for global democracy programs at the McCain Institute and worked for 7 years as the Georgia head of the National Democratic Institute. Now, the McCain Institute is named after the former Arizona Senator John McCain, who was in the Republican Party, ran for president, and kind of embodied this Cold War, I would say, conservatism. He was aligned with neocons, but also sometimes positioned himself as trying to be slightly more centrist than the neocons. But when it came to foreign policy, especially in the post-Soviet world, he was a kind of belligerent neoconservative in terms of Western posture. But McCain Institute, which is a large NGO affiliated with Arizona State, this is McCain's home state, is put out this very interesting report because sometimes, and this is something that I think we've discussed before, you get this situation where sometimes liberals tend to be very enamored with their own ideological presuppositions that prevent them from seeing things concretely and objectively. And sometimes you get these more conservative people who are a little bit more realistic, although their politics disagree with. They sometimes have a little more realistic observations about the limits of certain dynamics. So the report is only 10 pages. It's not long, and maybe we can include the link in the comments of this video. But the important thing, there are 2 or 3 important points that I think are made in this report. So when they came to Georgia this was on September 2nd through September 8th, 2024, they talked to a lot of people in NGOs. They talked to all of the major opposition parties, Salome Zurabashvili. They did not talk to Georgian Dream. But it seems like people whom they're affiliated with did have some discussions off the record with Georgian Dream that are referenced in the report. And they were and this was also part of a Rondelli Foundation and Black Sea Trust organized, quote unquote, Friends of Georgia mission to Tbilisi. And this included the always belligerent former U.S. ambassador to Georgia, Ian Kelly, and a number of other people. But a couple of conclusions that I think are important to point out is that the article basically says everybody expects there to be a crisis after the elections. That when the elections are over, there's going to be some kind of political crisis, that nobody believes that the elections are going to end smoothly. Now, the opposition, of course, whom they spoke with, said this because Dream, if they lose, won't accept the results. But they also understand that no matter what happens, that if the opposition loses, they will mobilize people to the streets, right? This is something the report says directly. A second and probably more consequential finding of this report was about the inability for the opposition to easily unite. So they make this reference to academic literature, which has its limits, but for the sake of discussion, that refers to Georgia as this hybrid democracy, okay, which is generally how Georgia has been described in the academic literature for a while, right? It still is. I mean, even during its close adherence to EU requirements, didn't really matter. Georgia's always understood as this quote unquote hybrid democracy. That in these situations, there needs to be a unified opposition to democratically unseat the incumbent government. But they were trying to figure out why is it that the opposition can't actually unite to become a united force. And it was interesting because some of their conclusions were that, especially in their direct discussions with Georgi Gacharia, they found out that, at least from Gacharia's point of view and point of view of some other of the opposition forces, that people dislike UNM more than they dislike Georgian Dream. That was one finding. And a second finding was that was corroborated by, I guess, some of their traveling in regions outside of Georgia, where they said people had much more important issues that were going to dictate how they voted than foreign policy alignment or the EU. So the average Georgian voter outside of the center of Tbilisi actually sees the upcoming election very differently. They hate UNM. They do not believe that, sort of a crude geopolitical worldview is actually representative of how they feel about the country and the country's politics. And they're very concerned with economic issues. And the discussions with opposition parties all gave reasons for why they couldn't unite. And so even though the McCain Institute was suggesting that everybody organize around UNM, all the other parties said, no, this would be a death sentence. No, we can't. This is impossible. They also point out a couple of interesting statistics, which is that, which one statistic that I'll point out, and then I'll give it over for conversation, which was that, there are trajectories in the country that are justified by poll numbers that kind of clash with the existential framing of the election. One of them being that even since the adoption of this so-called foreign agent or transparency law, that trust in certain state institutions has increased, including in the police, which was interesting, and that you still have a kind of heavy minority of people, something like 35% of the population, who even supported the law being passed in the first place. And so you can see a little bit clearer picture of the kind of social terrain and political terrain for why I think certain actions and maneuvers, political maneuvers of Georgian Dream have taken place. I think that the policy recommendations of this report are quite belligerent, just increased sanctions, increased pressure. But I think the observations, I think, are worth anybody reading, because as good, and the last thing I'll say is, as good thinking people, I think we should read everything, right? We should read what the opposition says, what the neoconservatives say, what Georgian Dream says, what the liberals say, because I think, I study all the positions quite closely, and I know we all do. And the reason is because that can help us have, we still have political positions, but we need to have an objective understanding to the degree possible of what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in general, we should also strive for understanding everyone on their own terms as well, because I think that is like a huge problem with how everyone just kind of ridicules and mocks everyone's position. And for me, it's like you really understand where they're coming from to get what they're doing, even if you don't agree with them. That note will end on what workers want. This again is sort of workers from our union surveying some of their needs, what they want to see on the political agenda, and not and also what they don't want to see and they're sick of. So it's like the consciousness is also that they're unionized workers, so it's a little bit different than maybe everyone else. I think how I would understand Georgian Dream is that Georgian Dream is focusing on investments, tourism, which benefits small business, and poverty reduction. Problem with this scenario is that there's this whole working poor that's completely left out. Well, they're completely left out of everyone, but the approach through Georgian Dream is that as long as there are some jobs, as long as there's generous or semi-generous social programs for the poor to kind of lift up the severe, reduce poverty and so on and so on. But this is also how the UN has also framed development and poverty reduction. It's also because there's a capture of world institutions that say that this is what countries should focus on, not building the middle class, not about unionizing, about decent jobs, but about, let's just create a kind of country where you don't have totally poor. So it's more about the shift in global thinking in the past 40, 50 years. So Georgian Dream is following along in that similar kind of vein. And this is where our workers, working class people, including me, including Rezi, and all of us who are part of this politics, part of working and poor, is that they want to see wages that are the same in urban centers and also the regions. Because a lot of times regions get paid less because they assume that it's cheaper there. And they pay more to urban workers. Problem with that is that actually some products are actually more expensive in regions because of transportation and not enough incentive. There's they want to have better wages. They want to have ability to have jobs where there's career advancement. They want to be able to make a living wage. They don't have to emigrate. The problem is that they see that immigration is a huge problem as well. And one of the main things is almost always people over 50 will say, I never hear this in young people, because I don't think they even know the concept. It's like they want fixed prices on goods that people use the most, like bread and maybe cheese and so on. So like things that people eat all the time that make up their main subsistence, they want those prices fixed because of the inflation. These prices keep going up and up, and their wages cannot keep up, and it's taking a big share of their wages. So that's another thing that they want to see. Decent life, it's like being able to afford, have family, be able to travel, be able to have food on the table, not worried about inflation the next day, you won't be able to afford food. Not, these are some of the themes that they discuss. Now, what they don't want to hear is things that they said are not relevant to their lives. They said things like they keep talking about certain technologies they've never used that have nothing to do with them. LGBTQ questions they said they have nothing to do with. EU integration, have some said like, I mean, we don't care that much. We want our, like, these things seem very far away from them. Making everything geopolitical, and the bickering between opposition and government, they don't want to hear anymore. And so these things are like, and I had done this like kind of game once. I was like doing a training in like in regions, and I said like, what do your families talk about? They had to write down what their families are talk about and their friends. What does the media talk about, and what does the government say talk about? And there were all three different things. Everyday conversations are about food, putting university was another thing, education, right? Putting the kids through college, paying bills, dealing with healthcare costs. There was another thing that they wanted to have is like good, free, or cheap, accessible healthcare. These are the everyday conversations. Somebody got sick. Oh, they're fundraising for. Oh, someone died. They need to come up with money for the funeral costs. These are like everyday conversations. Or someone got married and they want to live, with their partner and have a family. What our entire conversations are around niche, niche issues to them. Foreign agent law, or whatever, foreign transparency law, anti-LGBT law. These are very far away from their lives. These do not reflect their problems. And so for the sort of EU to frame it that the democratic backsliding is happening because of these two laws that most people don't care about or are affected by them is a kind of a crazy thing, right? Like, can you imagine if the EU was like, we will stop the accession if you don't increase the minimum wage? It's like, we will stop if you don't have unemployment insurance for people. We will stop until there's like a pension that's like a decent pension, not this sort of private public thing they have. Like what they're willing to stop the EU integration process over that actually affects democracy and people, because I'm sorry, it's very hard to have a democracy when people are incredibly poor and are very much affected by this. These are the things that they could actually pull and be like, no, until you change these things, we won't, accept you. But really, they pull it on funding law, like if transparency, financial transparency of NGOs and anti-LGBT, since this is what they reference. Mostly the transparency law. The anti-LGBT is a much more minor. But this is what EU cares about enough to stop the entire process and pretty much call for the removal of the current government. It's like very fishy to me, right? It's like what are the priorities? Like where, what is really democracy in this place? Because it seems like they care more about EU interests than they care about democracy or reaching more people. So in this scenario, whoever wins, no one is going to focus on working class issues. Like that's very clear. There's no plan for it by anybody. There's not even consciousness to even do that. And look at, like, I was looking at evolution gaming and asking, and if you if you are waiting for, like, if a strike happened, Evolution Gaming still continues on. I don't know what level, but Evolution Gaming just apparently just closed down a lot of their parts in Georgia and just moved them somewhere else. Like, if this is the kind of thing that would happen, right? If you don't have like a certain kind of level of development of industry, and you only attract these kinds of easy to move shops, even if you strike, even if you increase certain workers' leverages, you will still be left without anything because they can shut down shop and leave. So these are kinds of thinking that we really should be focusing on, right? What kind of business that would be here that would create the kind of working class that would stay here and would not be so disposable and taken down in like one day. So there's a lot of complexity around building, again, a middle class, what's the role of the state, what's the role of the unions, and so on. No one understands this or takes it seriously. And this is the biggest problem. This is my biggest criticism towards Georgian Dream and opposition and everybody else. Any other comments before we wrap up?
No, I think we should wrap up.
Yeah. Rezi, do you have any comments on this?
No.
Okay. Gio?
No, I don't think so.
Tired, yeah. Either we're tired or we're boring everyone else. Okay, so let's finish this and we can come up. We'll have another show. I think we should have another show right before the elections, and then after the elections. So we will see you all soon. Have a great day. Thanks for listening.